The forest was not silent before the battle. It held its breath. A crust of frozen snow cracked under the weight of pine needles falling in the slow, pre-dawn wind. In a shallow ravine choked with dead ferns, a Soviet T-34 sat with its engine dead, a predator in ambush. Inside its steel bowels, 4 men existed in a universe of their own. This was not just a crew. It was a fractured family, held together by grim necessity. Captain Viktor Semenov, the commander, pressed his forehead against the cold rubber of his periscope. His eyes, the color of river ice, were older than his 25 years. In his pocket, a worn photograph of a laughing woman and a small girl in Leningrad was a weight heavier than any shell. Every order he gave was a calculation, not just of ballistics, but of their chances to ever see home again. To his right, hunched over the gunner's sight, was Sergeant Sergei the Monk Volkov. He earned his nickname for his pre-war life in a monastery archive and his unnatural, almost spiritual calm. Now he applied that same focus to the crosshairs, his breath a slow, steady steam in the freezing air. For him, each shot was a sacrilege, a necessary sin he would spend a lifetime atoning for. Below them, in his own private world of levers and gauges, was driver Ivan the Badger Petrov. A former tractor mechanic from the Urals, he understood the T-34's engine like the heartbeat of a living thing. He could feel a misfire through the soles of his boots. His motivation was simple and profound. The tank was his home, the only thing between his crew brothers and the shrapnel storm outside. He protected his machine to protect his men. And then there was loader Alexei the Bull Markov, a dock worker from Odessa, built like a brick wall, his arms a tapestry of old tattoos and new burns. He hummed a tuneless Crimean folk song under his breath, a nervous habit. In his breast pocket was a single dry cherry blossom sent from his fiancée, a promise of a spring he feared would never come. His strength was a weapon, but his heart was a vulnerability he hid behind a constant, grimacing smile. They had been waiting for an hour. The tension was a 5th crew member, squeezing the air from the compartment. Then, the world changed. A low, ground-shaking rumble vibrated through the hull. Not the familiar sound of Soviet engines, but the deeper, predatory purr of German Maybachs. Through the trees, monstrous shapes materialized in the gray half-light. 2 Tiger tanks, their long 88mm guns swinging like the snouts of primordial beasts, advanced with arrogant, methodical slowness. They were not just tanks, they were moving fortresses, and they believed themselves invincible. Victor's voice was a dry rasp, barely audible. He didn't shout. In this silence, a whisper was a scream. Markov, armor-piercing. Volkov, lead tiger. Track and lower plate junction. Petrov, be ready to dance. Alexei's humming stopped. His massive hands, moving with a surprising, balletic grace, found the heavy, cold round. The clang of the breech block closing was the loudest sound in the universe. Sergei's eye was fused to the sight. He did not see a tank. He saw geometry, distance, wind, the slight tremor in Ivan's idling engine. He exhaled half a breath and held it. Now. The gun fired. The inside of the T-34 transformed into a cathedral of violence. A blinding flash of white-hot light, a deafening crack that was more felt than heard, slamming into their chests. The smell of burnt powder, ozone, and hot metal flooded the space. Through his periscope, Victor watched the result. The shell struck true. But it was not a clean kill. It smashed into the Tiger's drive wheel, shearing metal in a shower of orange sparks. The massive tank lurched, its track whipping off like a broken spinal cord. It was crippled, not dead. And then Victor saw it. The driver's hatch flew open, and a figure, wreathed in escaping smoke and steam, began to claw its way out. A second figure followed, his uniform already smoldering. They were human, burning and screaming in the open air, before a secondary explosion from within swallowed them in a fireball. Victor's jaw tightened. He had aimed for the machine, but he had killed the men. Sergei saw it too in his telescopic sight, and closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his lips moving in silent, frantic words. Chaos erupted. The second Tiger roared to life, its turret spinning towards their position with terrifying speed. "Back, Ivan! Now!" Victor barked. The Badger threw the T-34 into reverse. They shot backwards out of the ravine just as a tree where they had been hidden ceased to exist. It was vaporized by an 88mm shell, transforming into a storm of splinters that rattled against their armor like hellish hail. What followed was not a battle. It was a desperate, high-stakes chase through a maze of ancient pines. Ivan Petrov became an artist of survival. He used the terrain as his brush. He slid the tank behind a low hill, reversed into a thicket, using the dense trees as a momentary, fragile shield. The Tiger was a behemoth, slower to turn, but its gun was a scythe. Every near miss was an earthquake. A shell impacted 3 meters to their left, and the concussion wave hit the T-34 like a physical hammer. The crew was thrown violently in their harnesses. Glass from the gauges shattered. A small, sharp piece sliced across Alexei's cheekbone. He cursed, wiping the blood with the back of his hand, smearing it across his face like war paint, and immediately reached for another shell, his humming now a low, persistent growl. For 3 endless minutes, they were prey. Then, Sergei saw his chance. The pursuing Tiger, forced to navigate around the burning wreck of its comrade, exposed its flank for a critical 3-second window. "Stop!" Sergei hissed. Ivan stood on the brakes. The tank slewed to a halt. Fire. The second shot was perfect. It pierced the thinner side armor of the Tiger and found its heart. The effect was cataclysmic. The German tank erupted from within. A jet of flame shot from every hatch. The turret, lifted by the force of the ammunition cooking off, shifted with a grotesque metallic groan. The shock wave hit the T-34, a hot, foul-smelling wind carrying the scent of burnt fuel and something unspeakable. Inside there was no cheer, only a heavy, breathless silence broken by the sound of their own panting and the ping of their cooling armor. Alexei leaned against the breech, his head bowed. Ivan rested his forehead on the steering levers. They had done it. 2 Tigers. Against all odds. It was in that moment of exhausted relief that the universe struck back. There was no warning roar, no dramatic approach, just a high-pitched shriek tearing through the air, instantly familiar and utterly terrifying. The sound of an incoming shell meant for them. The world turned white and then black. The impact was a cosmic bell strike, directly on their rear hull. The force lifted the 30-ton tank and dropped it back to Earth with a sickening crunch of buckling steel. Every light died. The engine emitted a final, shuddering gasp and fell silent. A cascade of sparks erupted from the shattered instrument panel, illuminating the crew's stunned faces in a hellish strobe. Ivan fought the dead controls. "The transmission is gone! It's sheared clean!" he yelled, his voice cracking with something akin to panic. "The turret ring is jammed! We're locked!" Acrid, toxic smoke from an electrical fire began to coil into the compartment, stinging their eyes and throats. Victor coughed, peering through his periscope. His blood ran cold. A third tiger. It had circled silently during the chase. Now it sat 200 meters away, its massive gun tube to press rest, pointing directly at their motionless hull. It was so close he could see the scratches on its armor, the mud caked on its tracks. It did not fire. It waited, watching. A predator ensuring its kill was finished. The T-34 did not move. It played dead. Seconds stretched into a lifetime. Alexei held his breath, a fresh shell clutched uselessly in his arms. Sergei's hands were frozen on his controls. Ivan's knuckles were white on the unresponsive levers. Then, with a lazy growl, the Tiger's engine revved. Satisfied, it began to slowly reverse, its gun still trained on them, before finally turning and disappearing into the thick smoke of the burning forest. The sudden silence was deafening. It was broken only by the crackle of distant flames, the hiss of their own ruptured systems, and the ragged, shuddering breaths of 4 trapped men. Dawn's first true light, cold and merciless, filtered through the smoke and the pine branches. It did not bring hope. It illuminated their tomb. They were alive, but their war machine was dead. They were no longer hunters. They were wounded animals, caught in the open, with the entire German advance about to descend upon them. The first sensation was pain, a sharp, ringing ache deep in the bones, a chorus of bruises from the violent dance and the final catastrophic blow. The air inside the T-34 was thickening, turning poisonous. It tasted of acid, burnt wiring, spent cordite, and a new, ominous scent. The metallic tang of leaking fuel and the oily perfume of ruptured hydraulic fluid. The cold, which had been kept at bay by the engine's heat, began to seep in with predatory slowness, touching the sweat on their necks. Captain Victor Semenov moved first, a slow, deliberate unclenching. He wiped a trickle of blood from a cut above his eyebrow, his gaze sweeping the dim compartment. The emergency lamp flickered, casting jumping, grotesque shadows. His crew was emerging from their stupor, each man grappling with the new reality in his own way. Ivan the Badger Petrov was already in motion, his hands flying over the dead controls, his touch now diagnostic, desperate. He flipped switches that yielded nothing, pumped pedals that met no resistance. His face, usually a mask of gruff concentration, was pale. This machine was his charge, his reason for being here. Its silence was a personal failure, a profound loss. He muttered not curses, but technical terms, a mechanic's lament for a fallen beast. The final drive housing is cracked. Fluid is everywhere. The traverse motor is seized solid. We're a pillbox. A blind, immobile pillbox. Sergei, the monk. Volkov remained statue still at his gunner's station. His eyes were fixed on the narrow, now useless view through his optic. The burning forest, the hulks of the tigers they had killed. He saw the ghosts in the smoke, the men who had burned. His hands, which had been so steady to deliver death, now trembled faintly on the firing mechanism. He was retreating inward, the moral cost of their survival crashing down in the sudden silence. He reached into his tunic, fingers brushing against a small, simple wooden cross. Alexei the Bull Markov was the opposite. Adrenaline still coursed through him, demanding action. He had been in the act of loading, and his body thrummed with unused kinetic energy. The cut on his cheek bled freely, mixing with sweat and grime. He slammed a fist softly against the breech of the cannon. "We can fix it. We have tools. We can—" His voice trailed off as he looked at Ivan's despairing face. His gaze then fell to the ammunition racks. His professional count began automatically. 4 armor-piercing rounds, 2 high explosive, a handful of machine gun belts. Their world had shrunk to this finite, terrifying arithmetic. Victor knew his first duty was assessment. He climbed with stiff, painful movements to the commander's hatch. The seal was warped. He put his shoulder into it, and with a grinding shriek of bent metal, it swung open. The cold morning air hit him like a physical slap, clean and brutal. The scene before him was a painting of aftermath and looming threat. Their tank was perched at the edge of the small ravine, its rear hull shattered and dark with leaked fluids. Behind them, the 2 Tigers burned with a low, persistent roar, sending pillars of black smoke into the pale sky, a beacon for every enemy for kilometers around. Before them lay a shattered landscape, the ruins of a nameless village, a few skeletal brick chimneys, the blackened ribs of houses, a collapsed church bell tower. Beyond that, a vast open field of frozen mud and shell craters stretched to a distant, dark line of forest. Their forest. The Soviet lines were there, somewhere, kilometers of a killing ground away. They were in no man's land, but not a quiet one. The sound of the front was a constant, low-grade thunder on the horizon. But closer, much closer, came other sounds. The distant clank of tracks, sharp, guttural shouts in German, the whine of a reconnaissance vehicle. The Germans were not gone. They were consolidating, probing, cleaning up. The 2 destroyed Tigers would demand investigation. He dropped back inside, his face grim. "Listen," he said, his voice cutting through the gloom. "The engines are gone. The gun is frozen. We are in a shallow scrape with 2 enormous signal fires at our back. The Germans will come. Soon." The words hung in the toxic air. Each man processed the sentence of their situation. Ivan nodded, his mechanic's mind already shifting from grief to survival. "The hull is intact forward. The machine guns might work if the linkages aren't bent. We can turn the lower front plate toward the village. It's the thickest armor." Sergei finally spoke, his voice hollow. "We have 6 shells. We cannot maneuver to aim. We are a target, not a tank." "Then we become a fort," Alexei growled, wiping his cheek again. "We dig in around it. Use the wreckage." Victor shook his head. "A fort that cannot move is a tomb. They will flank us, or call in artillery, or just wait until we starve." He looked at each of them, seeing the fear, the defiance, the resignation. "We will defend, but we also need to think. Observe. The village ruins are close. They offer concealment, maybe a way to observe their approach, to improvise." The decision was made not by order, but by silent, collective understanding. They would use what they had. Ivan and Alexei began the grim inventory. Tools were checked: a heavy sledgehammer, wrenches, the long-handled engineer's axe, its blade worn but sharp, meant for cutting wood, clearing debris, a brutal, multi-purpose tool of steel and oak. It was tossed into a corner with a heavy thud. Water, rations, medical kit. The items were pitifully few. It was Sergei, from his static post at the gunner's sight, who saw the movement first. "Infantry," he whispered, the word slicing through the compartment. 4 figures in field gray, moving in a low, professional crouch from the edge of the distant tree line. A German patrol, drawn by the smoke, advancing toward the burning Tigers, and inevitably to their own immobilized T-34. A new kind of tension, wire-taut, replaced the despair. They were hunters again, but trapped in their den. Victor took his place at the periscope. Ivan, traverse the hull. 5 degrees left. Use the manual crank. Sergei, you have the coaxial. Wait. Let them come closer. They are scouts. They want to confirm the kill. The manual crank for rotating the entire tank on its locked tracks was a brutal piece of machinery. Ivan and Alexei threw their weight onto it, muscles corded, sweat breaking out anew. The tank groaned, a wounded beast being forced to turn its head. Inch by agonizing inch, the front shifted to face the approaching threat. The Germans were cautious. They fanned out, using craters and rubble for cover. One pointed directly at their T-34. They knew it was there. They were checking if it was dead. Victor's hand rested on Sergei's shoulder. The lead one, near the broken wall. Short burst. Sergei's trembling stopped. The target was a problem in geometry again. He aligned the sights. His breath stilled. He squeezed the machine gun trigger. The sound inside the hull was a deafening, violent clatter. Through the periscope, Victor saw the dust kick up around the lead scout, saw the man jerk and fall. The other 3 immediately scrambled back, disappearing into cover, unleashing a furious storm of rifle fire that pinged and whined off their armored hide. The brief, vicious exchange left a new silence, louder than the last. They had declared they were alive. They had drawn a line in the dirt, but they had also screamed their position to every German within earshot. As the echoes of the gunfire faded, a deeper, more familiar sound began to grow in the distance. Not the sporadic cracks of rifles, but the heavy, deliberate crunch of tracks. A single, powerful engine, moving toward them from the direction of the village ruins. Victor peered through the optics. His blood, already cold, seemed to freeze solid. Creeping through the shattered main street of the village, a 3rd Tiger tank emerged. It was cautious, its commander no doubt informed of the 2 lost giants. It stopped behind the relative cover of a collapsed brick building. Its long 88mm gun began to traverse, slowly, methodically, searching the tree line, the ravine, until it stopped. It was pointed directly at them. The chapter ends with the Tiger's engine idling, a low, threatening rumble across the silent field, its gun an unblinking black eye fixed on their steel coffin. The trap was no longer a possibility. It was here. It had them in its sight, and they had 6 shells with which to answer. The Tiger did not fire. It waited. A monstrous steel sphinx offering only a silent existential riddle. Are you dead? Or will you force me to finish you? Its gun remained fixed on their position, an unblinking cyclops eye. The morning sun, weak and pale, glinted coldly on its barrel. Inside the T-34 time dilated. Each second stretched into a minute, each heartbeat a drum solo in the crushing silence. The only sound was the faint, ticking hiss of their own cooling metal and the distant, idling rumble of the enemy engine. Captain Victor Semenov's mind, trained for rapid tactical calculus, became a frozen lake. Every option splintered and sank. Charge. The tank was a statue. Retreat. The ground was their prison. Return fire. Their gun was frozen, pointing uselessly into the forest, a paralyzed limb. To aim at the Tiger, they would have to manually crank the entire 30-ton hull on its jammed turret ring, a labor of minutes under the enemy's direct gaze. A suicide note, written in sweat. He's probing. Victor finally said, his voice sounding strange and flat in the thick air. He saw the infantry take fire. He knows we're alive. He's waiting to see if we're still dangerous. Sergei, the monk. Volkov had not moved from his gunner's sight. The tiger filled his entire world. He could see the commander's cupola, the faint slit of his vision block. He imagined the German officer inside, calm, professional, evaluating them as a problem in gunnery. The crosshairs of Sergei's sight lay over the tiger's lower front plate, the thickest armor, impervious to their gun at this angle and range. A perfect, futile target. His earlier tremor was gone, replaced by a fatalistic stillness. He was waiting for the end, already beginning the prayer he would not have time to finish. "We have to make him think we're dead," Ivan the Badger Petrov hissed, his eyes wide. "No movement, no sound. He'll get bored. He'll leave." It was the desperate logic of a wounded animal playing dead before a bear. Alexei, the bull. Markov disagreed. His energy, with no outlet, was curdling into a volatile rage. "He's not leaving. He's sitting there to keep us pinned while he calls an infantry or a Panzerfaust team. We have to hit him. Now. While he's alone." His massive hand gripped the breech handle of their frozen cannon, as if he could force it to turn by will alone. Victor made the decision. It was the only one that offered a sliver of agency. We fire. One shot. Not to kill him. To scare him. To make him back off. We show him we can still bite. He looked at Sergei. "Can you hit his gun mantlet? Damage the barrel? Jam his turret?" Sergei's eyes flickered with a ghost of calculation. The mantlet was a smaller, harder target. A glancing hit could achieve the goal, or it could do nothing. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Ivan, Alexei, the manual hull traverse. On my mark. 3 degrees right, smooth, like you're moving a mountain. Sergei, you'll have one chance as we swing past." The labor that followed was Herculean and excruciating. Ivan and Alexei bent to the heavy steel crank. They pushed with their legs, their backs, every corded muscle screaming. The tank's hull groaned in protest, metal scraping on seized metal. It moved with agonizing slowness. Through his periscope, Victor watched the tiger. Did it notice the slight shift? Did the long German gun twitch in response? It felt like an hour. It was 90 seconds. "Stop," Victor whispered. The word a sharp exhalation. The tiger's front glacis plate was now centered in their gun's limited field of fire. Not the mantlet. The range was less than 300 meters. Point blank for tank warfare, and utterly hopeless. "The angle is wrong," Sergei said, his voice a hollow monotone. "I have only the front plate. It will bounce." "Then we aim for the track," Alexei grunted, heaving a high explosive shell into the breach. "Cripple him like he crippled us." "He won't break his track at this range," Ivan countered, his mechanic's mind analyzing. "We need armor piercing. Hit the drive sprocket." "We have 4 AP rounds," Victor stated, the arithmetic of their demise now dictating tactics. "We use 1, driver's view slit. A lucky shot might blind him." It was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance, but it was a chance. The ritual was macabre. Alexei swapped the shell, the heavy clang of the breech a death knell. Sergei exhaled, settling into the stock. The tiger hadn't moved. It was a perfect, static target. And it was about to kill them. Fire. The cannon roared. The flash, the concussion. They were now familiar demons. Victor, glued to the periscope, saw the tracer streak across the short distance in a blink. It struck the tiger's upper front plate, just below the driver's port, in a blossom of bright orange sparks. For a nanosecond, hope, desperate and wild, flared in his chest. Then the sparks died. A black smudge marred the German steel. Nothing more. The round had ricocheted harmlessly into the sky. The effect on the tiger was instantaneous and terrifying. It had its answer. The wounded animal had snapped its teeth and found them blunt. The predator's patience vanished. The German tank's engine roared from an idle to a furious snarl. It lurched forward, not to charge, but to align itself perfectly. It halted again, now fully broadside to them, presenting not its tougher angled front, but its flatter side profile, a gesture of contemptuous confidence. The turret adjusted with a slow, hydraulic whine they could almost hear. They were now facing the full, terrifying length of the 88mm gun, pointed directly at their immobilized hull. "Load a P!" Victor shouted, the ice in his veins finally shattering. Panic, pure and electric, surged through the compartment. Alexei fumbled with a second armor-piercing round, his hands, for the first time, clumsy with fear. Ivan stared, paralyzed, at the approaching doom through his vision slit. Sergei could only watch the enemy gun, a dark circle that seemed to suck the light from the world. The tiger fired. The universe ended in sound and light. The impact was cataclysmic. It struck their frontal armor, but not on the thick, sloped plate. It hit where the hull met the immobilized turret, the welded joint already stressed from the first hit. The world dissolved into a deafening metallic scream. A jet of white-hot fire and molten metal spurted through a breach in the weld seam. The shockwave was a physical entity, throwing Ivan from his seat, slamming Alexei against the ammunition racks. Victor's head cracked against the periscope housing, stars exploding in his vision. When the ringing in his ears subsided to a high-pitched whine, the world had changed again. The air was thicker, hotter, filled with choking smoke and a new, acrid smell, ozone and seared steel. A thin, deadly shaft of daylight pierced the compartment from a fist-sized hole near the turret ring. Their armor had been violated, but they were not dead. The round had not penetrated fully. It had been a brutal, glancing blow that smashed the already damaged joint. It finished what the first hit had started. Ivan, pulling himself up, screamed a report that was half sob, half roar. "The turret ring is welded shut. The breech is spewing hydraulic fluid. The main gun is offline. The recoil system is shattered." They were now not just immobile. They were disarmed, a steel pillbox with no gun. Through the haze and the new, piercing shaft of light, Victor looked at his crew. Alexei was clutching his side, a sharp piece of spalled metal having torn through his jacket. Sergei had blood from a nosebleed dripping onto his tunic, his eyes wide with a shock that had broken through his monastic calm. Ivan's face was a mask of soot and utter devastation. Outside, the Tiger's engine revved once, a satisfied growl. It began to reverse again, slowly, deliberately. It did not fire the killing shot. It had delivered its message. It had turned them from a wounded predator into a piece of scenery, a wreck to be ignored, to be collected later. It faded back, behind the ruins of the village, and was gone. The silence it left behind was absolute, heavier than the gunfire. It was the silence of a verdict. The mathematics of war had been solved. They were zero, a null value. Victor's gaze, blurry with pain and despair, swept the compartment. It fell on the tools scattered during the frantic loading, the wrenches, the sledge, and there, lying where it had been tossed, the long handle of the engineer's axe, its steel head gleaming dully in the sliver of intrusive light. He stared at it. A tool for cutting wood, for digging, for prying. A primitive instrument in a war of machines. Then his mind, against all odds, made a connection. A desperate, insane, and horrifyingly clear connection. He saw not the axe but its potential. He saw the tiger's vulnerable, rubber-padded steel tracks. He saw the night. He saw the only equation left that didn't equal zero. His voice, when it came, was a dry, cracked thing, but it carried a terrifying new certainty. "We are not dead yet," he said. The silence after Captain Viktor Semenov's words was not of hope, but of stunned incomprehension. The statement hung in the smoke-tinged air, absurd and fragile, like a crystal glass balanced on the edge of their ruined cannon. Alexei the Bull Markov was the first to break it. He followed Victor's gaze to the axe, its utilitarian form suddenly conspicuous. A laugh, sharp and devoid of any humor, escaped his bloody lips. "What? We will chop firewood? Build a cabin?" The pain in his side made him wince, underscoring the ridiculousness. "They are 70-ton steel beasts. We have a woodcutter's tool." Ivan, the badger. Petrov did not look at the axe. He stared at the new glowing crack near the turret ring, a lethal wound in his tank's soul. His world was broken mechanics. The torsion bars are stressed. The hull integrity is compromised near the impact zone. Another direct hit in the same sector, and the armor will fail completely. We are an eggshell. He spoke of their death in the clinical language of physics and metallurgy. Sergei, the monk, Volkov, said nothing. He was looking at his hands, still resting on the dead firing controls. They had delivered the futile shot. They had been instruments of a failed defiance. Now, they were just hands. He closed them slowly into fists, as if testing their usefulness for something other than killing. Victor did not argue. He did not inspire. He began to plot, his voice low and methodical. A teacher, at a blackboard, in a condemned classroom. He turned away from them, his finger tracing an invisible map on the grimy steel wall. "The tiger did not kill us. It judged us irrelevant. A wreck. It will report our position as a neutralized target. They will not waste another shell. They have bigger battles to fight." He turned back, his ice-blue eyes capturing each of them in turn. "That is our only advantage. We are now part of the landscape, a piece of debris." He moved to the periscope, though the view was unchanged. "They have at least 2 more operational Tigers in the sector, maybe more. They will use this corridor, this path past the village, to support their advance. They think their flanks are secure. They think the only threat is from the front, from our lines kilometers away." Now he pointed to the axe. "A tank is a system, a chain of systems. Engine, gun, armor, tracks. The track is the weakest, continuous point. It is not solid steel. It is a series of linked plates, rubber pads, pins, and guides. It is complex, and it is exposed." Ivan, the mechanic, understood first. His despair flickered, challenged by a technical problem. "The drive sprocket," he muttered, his mind beginning to work despite itself. "Or the rear idler wheel. If you break a track link or shear a track pin, the track whips off. It takes hours to repair under fire. The tank becomes a static bunker, a target." "Exactly," Victor said. The word, a soft hammer strike. "We do not need to kill the steel beast. We need to cripple its legs. One tiger, immobilized in no man's land, is a greater problem for them than a destroyed one. It blocks the route. It demands a recovery vehicle, a crew exposed. It creates chaos." Alexei's rage was redirecting, finding a new focus. So what? We wait until one parks for tea, then run out with the axe like lumberjacks. They have machine guns. They have vision slits. They will see us and swat us like flies. No, Victor said, and now his plan unspooled, dark and intricate. We do not attack a vigilant tank. We attack a sleeping one or a distracted one. We use the night. We use the terrain we have not yet used. He gestured toward the shattered village. Not as a fort, as a hunting ground. The ruins are not cover to hide in. They are a maze to hide behind, to move through. We do not wait for them to come to our wreck. We go to theirs. The sheer, terrifying audacity of the plan began to permeate the compartment. They were no longer tankers. They were to become infantrymen of the most primitive, desperate kind. Saboteurs, huntsmen stalking dinosaurs with a stone tool. Sergei finally spoke, his voice a whisper. It is murder, not battle. It is butchery with a cleaver. The distinction for him was cosmic. One was a duel of machines and skill, however horrific. The other was intimate, visceral slaughter. It is survival, Victor countered, his voice hardening. They have left us no other duel. They have taken our machine. So we fight with what we have left, our wits, our knowledge of their weakness, and this. He walked over and picked up the engineer's axe. It was heavier than it looked. He hefted it, testing its balance. The worn oak handle fitted against his calloused palm. The steel head, dull and scarred, was nonetheless a solid, undeniable wedge of force. One man, with this, in the right place, at the right time, can do what our cannon could not, Victor said, holding the axe before them. It was no longer just a tool. It was a symbol of their reduction to primitivity and of their only remaining weapon. He laid out the grim algebra. They would wait for full dark. They would use the covering shell craters and the labyrinth of shattered walls to get close to the German leaguer, the place where the Tigers would likely halt for the night, believing the area secure. They would watch. They would learn the patterns, the changing of the guards, the rhythm of the engines turning off, the moments of maximum complacency. One of them would carry the axe. The others would act as lookouts, as diversions, as a shield. The objective was not to destroy, but to disable. A series of brutal, focused strikes on the track linkages of the outermost Tiger. Then, melt back into the ruins before the alarm was fully raised. They will not expect an attack from a neutralized position. They will think it is partisans, maybe a stray infantry patrol. They will be looking outward, toward the forest, not inward at the wreck they have already written off. The plan was insane. It was a thread of spider silk over a chasm. But it was a plan. And in the vacuum of their hopelessness, any plan with agency was a lifeline. Alexei's defiance crystallized into a grim acceptance. He nodded, a sharp jerk of his chin. The pain in his side would be ignored. The axe in his hands could become an extension of his rage. Ivan's mind was already adapting, shifting from tank systems to human terrain. We need dark grease, soot from the fires, to blacken our faces, our hands. The metal of the axe head must be wrapped in cloth to kill any gleam. Sergei looked from the axe to his own fists, then to the small wooden cross hidden beneath his tunic. The prayer he had started earlier remained unfinished. Perhaps this new, terrible path was his penance. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod of assent. He would go, not for murder, but to protect the others, to offer a chance, however slim, for atonement through survival. Victor saw their acquiescence, the weight of command transformed. He was no longer just their captain. He was the architect of a desperate, degrading, and possibly final gamble. He looked at the axe in his hands, then out through the jagged crack in their armor, toward the gathering twilight. The chapter ends with the four men sitting in the gloom of their steel coffin, no longer waiting for death, but preparing for a descent into a darker, more primitive kind of war. The axe lay on the floor between them, a cold, silent promise of the violence to come. The waiting was a separate kind of torture. The afternoon bled away with agonizing slowness, each minute measured by the creeping arc of the cold, white sun, the shifting shadows in the ravine, and the distant, intermittent thunder of the front, a reminder of the conventional war continuing without them. Inside the T-34, the atmosphere transformed from a morgue to a surgeon's preparation room. A grim, focused energy took hold. Ivan, the badger, Petrov, became a master of camouflage. Using a mixture of filthy engine grease, soot scraped from the inside of the barrel, and damp earth, he concocted a vile-smelling paste. He applied it with the methodical care of an artist, blackening his own face first, then turning to his crewmates. He darkened the high planes of Alexei's cheeks, the bridge of Sergei's nose, the back of Victor's hands. He smeared it over the pale skin of their necks, any part that might catch a stray moonbeam. Their uniforms were already stained with oil and blood, but he rubbed them with dirt, breaking up their silhouettes. Under his hands they ceased to be soldiers and became shadows, creatures of the earth. Alexei the Bull Markov focused on the weapon. He took the engineer's axe, his large hands wrapping and rewrapping the handle with strips torn from a dirty rag, ensuring a silent, non-slip grip. He then procured a piece of thick, felt-like insulation that had been shaken loose from the hull by the last hit. With meticulous, almost tender care, he fashioned a sheath for the axe head, tying it securely with wire. He tested the fit again and again, ensuring it would not rattle, that the deadly blade could be bared in absolute silence. His side still ached with a sharp, burning pain, but he folded the sensation away, compartmentalizing it, like another piece of equipment. Sergei, the monk, Volkov, prepared in silence. He checked the few remaining small arms: 2 PP submachine guns with worn magazines, a pistol, a handful of grenades. He distributed them, his movements precise and ritualistic. For himself, he kept only a long, sharpened entrenching tool, a brutal, archaic instrument of close combat. He sharpened its edge on a piece of grinding stone until it could shave hair from his arm. His prayers were internal now, a constant, silent stream beneath the surface of his focused calm. He was not preparing to kill. He was preparing to protect, to clear a path for the axe, to be a shield for the man who would wield it. It was a distinction that allowed him to function. Captain Viktor Semenov prepared the plan. With a stub of charcoal, he sketched a rough map on a piece of cracked laminate. He marked their position, the burning tigers, the village ruins, the likely approaches. He theorized where the German tankers, feeling secure, might establish a temporary night position, a place with clear fields of fire for their machines, but with cover for the crews to dismount, to smoke, to rest. He pinpointed a likely spot: a hard-packed courtyard near the collapsed church, bordered by high rubble walls on 3 sides. A perfect, defensible corral for steel beasts. "We do not attack the first tiger we see," he whispered, his finger tracing a path through the ruins. We observe. We find the one on the perimeter, the one closest to shadow, to a blind spot, the one whose engine cools first. As dusk finally gathered, purpling the sky and swallowing the details of the landscape, they conducted a final, nerve-shredding drill, the silent exit. One by one, they practiced slipping out of the lower emergency hatch beneath the driver's seat, a tight, claustrophobic opening that led into the cold mud of the ravine. They moved like ghosts, low to the ground, using the burned-out hull of the nearest Tiger as their first cover. The massive German tank was still warm, its metal creaking as it cooled, a giant's corpse offering meager shelter. The last of the light faded. A half-moon rose, bathing the shattered world in a monochrome, deceptive glow. It was both an ally and an enemy, illuminating pitfalls and casting deep, hiding shadows. It was time. Victor went first, sliding into the freezing mud with a soft, sucking sound. He was followed by Sergei, his eyes already scanning the gloom, then Alexei, clutching the wrapped axe to his chest like a sacred relic. Ivan came last, pausing for a heartbeat to lay a soot-blackened hand on the T-34's broken track in a silent farewell. Their world shrank to the next few meters of ground. They became animals, all senses screaming, the smell of cold mud, burnt metal and cordite, the feel of every stone, every shard of brick under their bellies. The sound of their own breath, terrifyingly loud in their ears, and the vast, ominous silence of the front at a lull. They reached the first ruin, a collapsed house, its interior exposed to the sky like a doll's house, smashed by a giant. They moved through it, not over it, using the skeletal walls as guides. Victor led with instinct honed by 1,000 tactical maps. Sergei flowed beside him, a silent wraith, his head constantly turning, listening for the scrape of a boot, the click of a rifle bolt. Then they heard it. Not the sound they feared, but the sound they sought. The deep, idling rumble of a Tiger's engine, somewhere ahead in the heart of the village. Then another. Not the aggressive roar of combat, but the steady, contented purr of machines at rest. Victor held up a closed fist. They froze. Creeping to the jagged edge of a shattered brick wall, they saw it. The German Nightleaguer. It was exactly as Victor had predicted. 2 Tigers sat in the moonlit courtyard. Their hulls were dark, hulking shapes, like sleeping dinosaurs. The closer one was maybe 30 meters away, its side presented to them, its long gun pointing away toward the distant Soviet lines. A small, carefully shielded fire glowed between the 2 behemoths, crewmen warming rations, their low, guttural conversation, and the occasional laugh floating across the cold air. A sentry was visible, a darker shape pacing slowly near the rear of the second tank. But their target, the first Tiger, was perfect. It was on the edge of the lighted area, half in shadow, cast by a standing fragment of a wall. Its engine coughed once, then fell silent. The crew had shut it down. A figure, the driver perhaps, dropped from his hatch, stretched, and walked toward the fire, leaving his machine unattended. The beast was asleep. The plan was in motion. The algebra of the axe required one variable to be solved: the approach. A 30-meter dash across open, moonlit ground, littered with rubble. Victor turned. His eyes found Alexei's in the gloom. He pointed to the Tiger, then to the axe, then to a deep shell crater halfway between their position and the tank. He then pointed to Sergei and Ivan, and then to opposite flanks. Their job was to be the tripwires, to watch the sentry, the crew by the fire, to be ready to create a distraction, to attack if the alarm was raised. Alexei's jaw tightened. He gave a single grim nod. He unsheathed the axe head, the pale moon finally catching the dull steel for a second before he pressed it against his leg, hiding its gleam. His world narrowed to a tunnel, the rubble at his feet, the distant crater, the massive, vulnerable track of the tiger. He took a breath, the cold air burning his lungs, the pain in his side, a distant throb. And then he moved. The chapter ends with Alexei launching himself from the cover of the wall into the open moonlight, a shadow among shadows, his body coiled for the sprint, the weight of the axe in his hand, both a burden and the only hope for 4 men left behind by the war of machines. The 30 meters ahead of him looked like an endless, exposed plain under the judging eye of the moon. Alexei Markov's world dissolved into a single brutal imperative. Do not be seen. The 30 meters to the shell crater stretched before him, like a gauntlet under the pale, merciless moon. Every sense heightened to a screaming pitch. The crunch of a single piece of gravel under his boot was a detonation in his ears. The rustle of his uniform against his skin was a flag unfurling. He moved not with a soldier's crouching run, but with the low, fluid lope of a predator, every muscle taut, every nerve alight. He saw nothing but the crater's dark maw. He heard nothing but the blood pounding in his temples, a rhythm syncopated with the distant, careless laughter of the German crew by the fire. The smell of their cooking, something tinned and fatty, wafted to him, a grotesque reminder of a normalcy that was a universe away. He reached the crater and plunged into its freezing, stagnant water without a sound, sinking to his chin. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath, screaming through the wound in his side. He ignored it. His eyes, wide and unblinking, lifted over the crater's rim. The tiger was closer now, a colossus of shadows and angled steel. He could see the details, the rough texture of the Zimmermitt anti-magnetic paste, the deep grooves of the tracks, the rubber-padded road wheels. He focused on the rear idler wheel where the track looped back. Ivan's lesson echoed in his mind. The track tension is there. A damaged idler or a broken link at the return point, and the whole track can whip off. From his flank, Sergei Volkov watched the sentry. The German soldier had paused, lighting a cigarette. The match flared, illuminating a young, tired face for a second before it was cupped against the wind. Sergei held his breath, his hand resting on the cold metal of the entrenching tool. His entire being was a silent prayer for the match to hold the man's attention for 3 more seconds. It did. Alexei rose from the water like a specter, dripping and silent. He covered the last 10 meters in a blur, pressing his back against the cold, vertical steel of the tiger's hull. The sheer mass of the machine vibrated faintly, with residual heat. He was now in its blind spot, a flea on the hide of a sleeping giant. The axe felt alive in his hands, a cold, eager weight. He dropped to his knees beside the massive track. Each link was as wide as his torso. He placed a trembling, blackened hand on the cold rubber pad. This was it. The moment where theory met chaos. He raised the axe. The first strike was a test. A controlled, powerful blow aimed at the connecting pin between 2 track links. It landed with a muffled, solid thud that seemed to him as loud as a cannon shot. He froze, pressing himself against the hull, listening. The laughter by the fire continued. The sentry coughed. The pin was dented but not sheared. The steel was hardened, designed to withstand tons of punishment. A cold, desperate fury rose in Alexei's chest. This was his purpose. This was his answer to the machines that had broken his home, his tank, his world. He thought of his fiance's cherry blossom, dust now in his pocket. He thought of the burning German crewman from the first Tiger. This was not a tactical strike anymore. It was vengeance, primal and personal. He adjusted his grip, took a fuller swing, putting the full force of his dockworker's shoulders, his bull strength, into it. Clang. The sound was different, sharper, metal on metal, no longer muffled by rubber. At the fire, one of the Germans paused, his head tilting. Sergei, watching, tensed. He made a soft, clicking sound with his tongue, a prearranged signal of warning. Alexei heard it. Panic, cold and slick, joined the fury. He had seconds. He struck again, at the same spot. Clang! A spark flew in the darkness. The German at the fire said something, standing up. The sentry turned, peering into the shadows, his cigarette a glowing red dot moving in the darkness. It was now or never. Alexei abandoned precision. He began hacking, a woodsman felling an iron tree. Clang, clang, clang. Each blow was a rebellion against the steel, a declaration of humanity in a war of engines. A piece of the track guide cracked. A pin began to deform, to jut out. Then a new sound, a screech of tortured metal. The track, under the immense tension of the idler wheel, groaned as the damaged link passed over a road wheel. The sentry shouted, a sharp, alert cry in German. Light exploded. A blinding white beam from the second Tiger's cupola swiveled and pinned Alexei in its act of brutal sabotage. He was caught like an insect in amber, axe raised, face a mask of soot, fury, and terror. Chaos erupted. A machine gun from the second Tiger opened fire, not at Alexei, he was too close to their own tank, but into the ruins, hosing the area where Sergei and Ivan were hidden. Brick dust and splinters filled the air. The crew by the fire scrambled for their weapons. Alexei did the only thing left. He screamed. A raw, wordless roar from the depths of his being, and delivered one final, two-handed overhead blow to the partially dislodged track pin. It sheared. With a sound like a giant whip cracking, the Tiger's left track snapped. The damaged link gave way. The entire immense length of steel and rubber, released from its tension, whipped off the road wheels with terrifying force. It scythed through the air, missing Alexei by centimeters, and slammed into a pile of rubble with a deafening, catastrophic crash. The Tiger lurched violently, settling at a drunken angle. It was now a behemoth with a broken leg. But Alexei had no time for triumph. A German crewman, the driver who had left his hatch, rounded the hull with a pistol. Alexei turned, swinging the axe in a wild, horizontal arc. It was not a tool anymore. It was a primordial weapon. The flat of the blade connected with the man's forearm. Bone snapped. The pistol flew into the darkness. From the ruins, Sergei emerged like an avenging spirit. He did not fire the submachine gun slung on his back. He closed the distance with the sentry in silence, his entrenching tool a blur. It was close, ugly, and mercifully quick. Victor and Ivan opened up with their PPSHS from separate directions, short, controlled bursts meant to create confusion, to pin the remaining crew behind their steel cover. Alexei, back! Victor's voice cut through the din. Alexei turned to run, slipping in the mud churned up by the thrashing track. The wounded German driver was shouting, clutching his arm. The second Tiger's machine gun was searching, trying to find a target, without hitting its own men. Then, A single, sharp crack. A rifle shot from a crewman by the fire who had found his cover. Alexei felt the impact like a punch from a giant. It entered his lower back on the right side, where his body was turned, and tore through him. He stumbled, the axe falling from his numb fingers. There was no initial pain, just a shocking coldness, a sudden, profound weakness in his legs. He did not fall. He took 2 more stumbling steps towards the crater, towards his crew. Then his legs folded under him. Sergei was there. He dropped his entrenching tool and caught the bigger man, staggering under his weight. He half-dragged, half-carried him back toward the cover of the ruins, as Victor and Ivan laid down a furious covering screen of fire, the tracers drawing angry red lines in the night. They reached the shattered wall and collapsed behind it. The German fire was intensifying, but it was disorganized, confused. They were shooting at shadows, at the sound of movement. The immobilized Tiger was a monument to their failure, its crew shouting in anger and shock. In the scant cover, Sergei laid Alexei down. In the moonlight he could see the dark, glistening stain spreading rapidly across the back of Alexei's jacket, a voracious black bloom. Alexei's breathing was ragged, wet. He looked up at Sergei, his eyes wide, confused. "The track?" Alexei gasped, a bubble of blood forming at the corner of his mouth. "Did it?" "It's off," Sergei said. His voice choked. "You did it. The beast is crippled." A faint, pained smile touched Alexei's lips. His hand fumbled at his chest pocket. Sergei understood. He reached in and pulled out the small, brittle, perfectly preserved cherry blossom. He placed it in Alexei's blackened hand. Alexei's fingers closed around it, his eyes fixed on the tiny pale shape, a memory of a promised spring. His breathing slowed. The shouts of the Germans, the sporadic gunfire, the groans of the wounded tiger. It all seemed to fade into a distant hum. He did not speak again. The chapter ends with Sergei crouching over his fallen comrade in the rubble, the cherry blossom clutched in a still hand. As the first cold drops of rain began to fall, mingling with the blood and the soot on the stones. The axe lay forgotten in the mud between the tanks, its work done, its price paid in full. The rain began as a soft whisper, then hardened into a steady, icy downpour. It fell on the ruins, on the 2 hulking tigers, one standing sentinel, one kneeling crippled, and on the 3 survivors huddled in the corpse-strewn labyrinth. It diluted the blood on the stones around Alexei Markov, turning it into faint, pink ghosts that trickled into the mud. Sergei Volkov remained kneeling, his hand still resting on Alexei's still warm shoulder. The torrent of prayer in his mind had dried up, leaving a desert of silent, howling emptiness. He had witnessed death before, delivered it from a distance through a gun sight. This was different. This was intimate. This was a brother dying in his arms, for a plan that felt suddenly insane and monstrous. He looked at his own hands, stained with Alexei's blood and the grime of the entrenching tool's work. These were not a monk's hands. They were a butcher's. Captain Viktor Semenov did not allow the grief to take root. He crushed it under the wheel of immediate, terrible necessity. He pulled Sergei back, his grip iron hard. They will come. Now, in this rain, on foot, to sweep the ruins, to find us. His voice was stripped of all emotion, a raw instrument of survival. He looked at Ivan, whose face in the flashes of distant lightning was a mask of horrified shock. The badger. The rain is our cover. We move now. Ivan Petrov was breaking. He was a man of machines, of cause and effect, of greased gears and logical systems. Alexei's death was not logical. It was a catastrophic system failure of their entire world. He stared at the body, at the tiny flower still visible in the clenched fist. We can't leave him," he choked out, the words barely audible over the drumming rain. "We are leaving him," Victor stated, the finality of it as cold and sharp as the axe blade. "He bought us time. He bought us a chance. We will waste it if we stay." He grabbed Ivan by the front of his tunic, forcing the mechanic to meet his gaze. "The Germans are no longer complacent. They are angry. They are hunting. Their radios are alive right now, calling for infantry, for support. We are not hunters anymore. We are the hunted. We need to move like ghosts, or we join him." The truth of it was a slap. Ivan's eyes cleared, refocusing from grief to fear, and from fear back to the mechanical problem of survival. He gave a stiff, jerky nod. They moved, leaving Alexei in the shadow of the wall. There was no time for burial, for rites. He became part of the landscape, another piece of debris in the rain-soaked nightmare. The dynamic of their trio shifted fundamentally. Sergei moved like an automaton, his earlier spiritual crisis frozen into a lethal robotic calm. He was the rear guard, his senses hyper-alert, his PPSH held not as a weapon of war, but as a tool for clearing a path through hell. Every sound, the skittering of a rat in the rubble, the creak of a loose timber, was a potential enemy. He was the conscience of the group, now silenced and weaponized. Victor became pure, calculating instinct. He led them not deeper into the village, but in a wide, desperate arc around its perimeter, using the rain and the chaos as a cloak. Their goal was no longer to attack, but to survive the night and circle back to the relative, fragile sanctuary of their own wrecked T-34. It was the only home they had left. But the Germans were not idle. The angry search they had predicted began with terrifying efficiency. They heard the shouts, now closer, more coordinated. The beam of a handheld searchlight, diffused by the rain, swept across alleyways ahead of them, forcing them to flatten themselves into shell holes filled with icy water. The sound of boots, many boots, splashing through mud, echoed between the broken walls. Then came the new threat, the low, guttural growl of an engine, but not a tiger's. Lighter, faster. The silhouette of a German SDKFZ 251 half-track emerged from the mist and rain, nosing into a square ahead of them. Its mounted machine gun swept back and forth. Infantry fanned out behind it, their movements professional, systematic. They were clearing the ruins, building by building. They were trapped. Ahead, the half-track blocked the square, the only feasible route back to the ravine. Behind, the search parties were closing in. They were in a tightening vice. Victor assessed their geometry of doom. The half-track was the key. Its machine gun could pin them down until the infantry surrounded them. It had to be neutralized. He gestured, a flurry of sharp hand signals in the gloom. Ivan, understanding machinery, would target the vehicle with grenades. Sergei would provide covering fire to suppress the infantry nearby. Victor would flank. It was a plan of pure, distilled desperation. They broke cover. Sergei opened up with his submachine gun, short, aimed bursts at the cluster of German infantry taking shelter behind a low wall. The sudden eruption of fire from the ruins caused the desired moment of confusion. Ivan, clutching 2 grenades, sprinted in a low crouch along the side of a collapsed house. The half-track's commander, exposed in his cockpit, shouted a warning. The machine gun began to traverse toward Ivan. Victor, from his flanking position, fired his PPSH at the commander, not to kill, but to distract. Rounds sparked off the half-track's armor. The commander ducked. It gave Ivan the 3 seconds he needed. He pulled the pins, held the grenades for a terrifying heartbeat, and lobbed them in a high, arcing throw. They landed, one on the engine deck, one just in front of the left track. The explosions were twin concussions of light and sound in the rainy square. The blast on the engine deck blew shrapnel into the compartment. The grenade by the track did not destroy it, but shredded several road wheels and damaged the steering. The half-track lurched, its engine dying with a screech, smoke pouring from its grills. It was another crippled beast, blocking the square, but no longer a mobile gun platform. The German infantry, however, were now fully alerted and enraged. A storm of return fire filled the square, kicking up fountains of mud and stone chips. Ivan, exposed from his throw, was hit. A rifle round grazed his temple, a hot line of fire across his skull. He went down, stunned, blood immediately sheeting down the side of his face, mixing with the rain. Sergei saw him fall. Without a thought, he broke from his own cover, firing his magazine dry on the run to keep the German heads down. He reached Ivan, grabbed him by the back of his belt, and began dragging him bodily toward the nearest doorway, bullets stitching the mud around their feet. Victor provided the final, brutal cover. He rose to his full height, emptying his magazine in a wide, sweeping arc, not aiming to hit, but to create a wall of noise and threat. He saw a German soldier rise to aim at Sergei and Ivan, and with his last rounds, cut him down. Then he was running, sliding into the shattered doorway just as a German machine gun team found its range, chewing the stone frame where he had been standing into dust. They were in a ground-floor room with no roof, 3 walls standing. Ivan was conscious but dazed, his face a mask of blood. Sergei was frantically trying to staunch the flow with a torn piece of his own tunic. The wound was ugly, but shallow. The skull was intact. The real damage was the concussion, the disorientation. Outside, the Germans were reorganizing, calling to each other. They knew they had the Russians cornered. The vice was clamped shut. Victor looked at his 2 remaining men. Sergei, the silent guardian, his ammunition nearly gone. Ivan, the broken mechanic, half blind with blood and shock. They were out of options, out of space, out of time. The algebra had turned against them. The brilliant, desperate variable of the axe had been expended, and now the equation was solving for their annihilation. He looked around the roofless room. At the back, a collapsed staircase led to a cellar, a black hole filled with rubble and stagnant water. A tomb, not an escape. The chapter ends with the 3 of them pressed against the wet, crumbling walls, listening to the assured, methodical footsteps and shouted orders of the German infantry closing in from all sides. The rain poured through the open roof, a celestial weeping for the inevitable end of the mad, brave saga of the crew of the T-34. The sound of boots splashing in the mud just outside the door was the only countdown they had left. The sound of the German boots outside the shattered doorway was not a mere noise. It was a physical pressure, a tightening of the air in the roofless room. Each splashing step was a hammer blow on the coffin lid of their hopes. Captain Victor Semenov's mind, which had navigated through tactical maps and desperate gambits, now faced a blank wall. The cellar was a trap. The doorway was death. The geometry was terminal. Ivan Petrov slumped against the damp wall, his head a throbbing universe of pain. The blood from his temple wound had slowed to a viscous trickle, mingling with rainwater on his collar. Through a haze of concussion, he saw not the crumbling bricks around him, but the intricate schematics of a T-34's transmission, the clean lines of a fuel injector, the order of machinery, a world that made sense. This chaos of mud, blood, and imminent bullet did not. He was a mechanic without a machine, a man whose purpose had been stripped away. He closed his eyes, waiting for the final, disordering impact. Sergei Volkov stood over Ivan, his body positioned between his wounded comrade and the door. The submachine gun in his hands was empty, a useless weight of metal. He had discarded it. In his right hand, he now held the sharpened entrenching tool, its edge glinting dully in the gray, rainy light. In his left, he found the small, simple wooden cross from beneath his tunic. He did not pray. He simply held it, his knuckles white. He was ready to meet his God, not with the distant thunder of a cannon, but with the silent, brutal intimacy of a shovel blade. He was making peace with the intimate killer he had become. Victor's gaze swept the room for the 10th time, a predator seeking an exit that did not exist. It snagged on a detail his mind had previously dismissed as irrelevant. Against the back wall, partly obscured by fallen plaster and a rotten timber, was not just a collapsed staircase, but the remnants of a heavy, iron-bound cellar door, now sagging on one hinge, and leading to it, a shallow gutter in the stone floor, carved by a century of rainfall, sloped not into the cellar, but out, under the foundation wall. A sewer, an ancient drain, perhaps no wider than a man's shoulders, choked with leaves and debris, but a potential artery leading out into the darkness beyond the house. It was not a plan. It was a phantom, a whisper of possibility in a world shouting their doom. He moved, not with stealth, but with a sudden violent urgency that snapped Sergei from his reverie. Victor did not explain. He grabbed the rotten timber and threw his weight against it, leveraging it like a crowbar against the sagging cellar door. The wood groaned, splintered. The rusted hinge screamed in protest. Outside, the German voices changed. The sound had alerted them. The careful advance turned into a decisive assault. A boot kicked at the remains of the front doorway. "Now!" Victor roared, a raw, animal sound. The cellar door gave way, collapsing inward to reveal a yawning black pit of stagnant air and the narrower, darker maw of the drain. It smelled of decay and wet earth. A German grenade sailed through the front doorway, clattering on the stone floor, its fuse hissing like an angry serpent. Sergei reacted. He did not dive for cover. He turned, planted his feet, and with a strength born of absolute finality, he shoved the dazed Ivan Petrov bodily toward Victor and the open cellar hole. "Go!" The word was not a suggestion, but a command, an absolution, a final gift. Victor caught Ivan, hauling him toward the black opening. He saw Sergei turn back toward the grenade, toward the doorway where the first German soldier was already silhouetted, rifle raised. Sergei did not raise his entrenching tool. He simply spread his arms, a dark, welcoming silhouette, a final, living barrier. The grenade exploded. The world in the room turned into a deafening roar of sound and a storm of shattered stone and whining metal fragments. The blast wave hit Victor like a physical wall, throwing him and Ivan into the cellar opening. They tumbled down into the freezing, shallow water and muck at the bottom. Above, in the dust and smoke, there was only silence. No gunfire, no cries from Sergei. He had consumed the violence with his body, muffling it, buying the last second of time his physics could afford. Victor did not look back. He could not. He grabbed Ivan, who was coughing and retching, and shoved him toward the narrow drain opening. "Crawl! Don't stop! Don't look back!" They entered the earth. The drain was a tube of pure, claustrophobic terror. It was tighter than the tank's hatch, lined with slime and the bones of long-dead rats. They pushed through cobwebs thick as cloth, gulping foul, oxygen-starved air. They could hear nothing of the world above, only the thunder of their own hearts and the desperate, scrambling sounds of their escape. Ivan led, his mechanic's hands finding purchase in the dark, his injured head forgotten in the primal drive to move forward. Victor pushed from behind, his mind a white blank, all tactics gone, reduced to the single instinct: follow the tunnel. After an eternity of suffocating darkness, a faint, gray light appeared ahead. Fresh, cold air, smelling of rain and mud, touched their faces. They pushed out of the drain's mouth, hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes at the base of the ravine, less than 50 meters from their own wrecked T-34. They lay in the mud, gasping, vomiting foul water, creatures born anew from the underworld. The rain had slackened to a drizzle. The sounds of the German search were distant now, concentrated on the ruins they had escaped. They had vanished from the enemy's map. Stumbling, supporting each other, they covered the last distance to their tank. It looked different now. Not a fortress, not a trap, but a relic. A grave marker for two of their own, and a sanctuary for the shattered remnants. They collapsed inside the familiar scarred steel belly. The silence was different from before. It was not the silence of impending doom, but the hollow, aching silence of aftermath. Ivan immediately tended to his head wound with shaky hands, the automatic actions of maintenance a lifeline to sanity. Victor sat at the commander's periscope, his body trembling with spent adrenaline and a grief too vast to yet feel. He looked out. The gray dawn was strengthening, and then he heard it. A new sound, rising from the east, from the direction of the Soviet lines. Not the sporadic thunder of before, but a rising, rolling, continuous roar. A deep, earth-shaking barrage. The sound was immense, organized, and moving closer. The long-awaited Soviet artillery, counteroffensive. He watched as, in the distance, the world erupted. The forest line where the German main force was presumed to be disappeared under a walking wall of fire and dirt. Shells walked across the field, methodical, devastating. And then he saw the consequences of their night's work. In the village square, the two Tigers were caught in the open. The operational one started to move, seeking to flee the bombardment. But the second Tiger, the one with the broken track, could not. It was a stationary target. It frantically tried to turn its turret, to return fire at an enemy it could not see. A Soviet artillery observer, somewhere in the advancing tide, must have seen the huge, immobile silhouette. A salvo of heavy shells walked across the courtyard. One landed directly in front of the crippled Tiger. The next one consumed it. The explosion was swallowed by the greater roar of the barrage, but Victor saw the fireball, saw the turret lift momentarily from its ring. The steel beast that had broken their tank and that they had crippled with an axe, was now a funeral pyre for its own crew, its strategic value reduced to zero. They had done it. At a cost so absolute, it felt like a defeat. The artillery moved past, advancing westward. In its wake, a strange, bruised quiet settled over their sector of the front. The German presence was gone, obliterated or retreated. Victor finally lowered himself from the periscope. He looked at Ivan, whose bandaged head was bowed, his shoulders shaking silently. He looked at the empty loader's position where Alexei had hummed his tuneless songs. He looked at the gunner's seat where Sergei had sought his impossible peace. They were alive. They had, against all physics and reason, changed the tactical picture. They had become a legend that would never be told. Victor's gaze fell to the floor of the tank. There, where it had been kicked during the final frantic hours, lay the engineer's axe. It was caked in mud, in grease, and in the dark flaking rust of Alexei's blood. He did not pick it up. He simply stared at it. This simple tool that had bridged the gap between the Stone Age and the Steel Age, that had turned mechanics into primitive warriors, and that had purchased this hollow, terrible morning. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for a single blinding moment, a shaft of light piercing the smoke of the battlefield, illuminating the axe where it lay on the steel floor, a cold, brutal, and undeniable testament to the price of a miracle.